Hey everybody, welcome back to part 3 of the Rusty Rolex. Let's recap a little bit. In part 1, we took the watch apart, disassembled it. We kind of made note of all the bad parts that we couldn't fix, disassembled and cleaned as much of the rust as we could out of the watch. Made our parts list, continued the disassembly. And you can see in part 1, we found a lot of debris in the watch, a lot of parts that were pretty bad. In part 2, we got our parts in, we had ordered. So we had some replacement parts, cleaned up some of the old parts that we could reuse, for those we could reuse, and got ready for pre-assembly. So here you can see this is just a short list of the parts that we had to replace in the watch. Also in part 2, what we did was pre-assembly. We tested the balance. We made sure that everything was cleaned and ready to go back, so that if we had any issues, we could take care of them then, before we did the assembly and found any issues that later in the assembly of the watch. So part 2 was pre-assembly, where we assembled most of the watch. We didn't complete it in part 2. We're going to complete it now in part 3. So let's get started with the final assembly of this watch. You can see part 2 we left off, the watch was running. I tested and timed the watch. We let it run for a few hours just to make sure that there were no issues. It's got a new mainspring, everything's lubed up, everything's in proper working condition, with the exception of what we haven't assembled, which is going to be the upper side of the watch. And here you can see we've got quite a lot to do on the upper side of the watch. The first thing I'm going to start with is this little jewel. This little jewel articulates with the date disc. And it's a little tricky, easy to lose if you're not careful, so be careful with these. This little jewel goes on to an articulated spring arm, which when the date disc turns, well, let's say the drive gear for the date disc, as that turns, there's a tapered lever on the underside of that gear, and that little jewel causes no friction, and it allows the snap. When you hear a snap, when you're actually changing the date, you'll hear this little disc is what's actually snapping sometimes. Otherwise, it's the date click on the clutch. So now we're going to put the cannon pinion out on the watch. Now this is the gear that holds the minute hand. It's friction fit onto the center pinion of the watch. We replaced that center pinion, if you remember, in part 2. I'm going to go ahead and test that. The next gear we're going to put on is the hour wheel. This is the wheel that drives the hour hand, and very important, of course. You're going to line that up. It articulates with 3 other gears, so we're going to get that situated perfectly in both the setting position and winding position. Once that's done, we can go ahead and get ready to put the drive gear for the date disc. Now this gear turns once every 24 hours. It has a tapered side underneath, if you look closely, and that little jewel that we put on earlier is the kind of the frictionless pin that pushes that down, so it changes the date at midnight. This gear, if I didn't mention it in part 1 when we took the watch apart, this is a reverse thread gear. I unfortunately couldn't find my special tool for this gear, or this little nut, and I used a driver instead. It's not the proper way to do it. I'm going to go ahead and order myself a new one, because I can't seem to find where I put the other one. It's probably in my bench somewhere, and I'll find that later. Again, it's reverse thread, so you're just going to carefully get it started and just gently just turn it slowly until it starts to thread itself, and then you can push it over. This holds that drive gear in place for the date disc. Also holds down the hour wheel, which is a good thing, so if you turn over the watch, the parts don't fall off. Once that's done, we'll put the stem in, we'll make sure everything works good, and just test it and make sure it's driving the correct way and that it springs and flips back into position. Well, here you can see I put the frame in for the date disc. This frame is held in with 2 or 3 screws, depending on which model you have. 3035, I believe, has 2 screws. There are several jewels that hold the date disc away from the frame, and then there is a small half screw with a notched edge that will hold it in place. Here you can see this is the click for the date disc, and I'm just pulling it out and notching it up with the notch on the date disc. Then we're going to just tighten up that half screw so that it holds the date disc down in place. That keeps it from ever popping out. Basically goes in the reverse way as when we disassembled it. Of course, as I'm assembling a watch, I always like to test every function to make sure that as I'm going along, everything is working correctly. If I have a little issue, I can solve it at that point instead of, going ahead and, putting the whole watch together and finding out you have an issue later on. So we're testing the 24-hour click on the date disc and that wheel, and you can see it snaps in perfectly. Now we'll go ahead and assemble the dial. With the dial clamp screws loosened, we can put the dial down. It's going to blow off any debris if it's on the watch, and then we'll tighten the 2 screws that hold the dial down. Those are dial feet clamps or dial clamps, however you want to call them. Again, on this particular model, there are 2 of them. Most Rolex watches only have 2, at least the men's versions. And now it's time to assemble the hands. Now we know I've set the watch to the midnight position and I pulled the stem out so that it's not working. That way we've got a watch that's free right at the midnight position, and we'll go ahead and put the hour hand on. You're just going to gently line that up and use your dial tool to just gently, very gently, just wiggle that down into position. You don't want it to go down to touch the dial. It will cause marks on the dial. Once the hour hand's in position, we'll go ahead and put the minute hand on. Again, you're going to follow the same process. You're just going to adjust its position. I'm using the smaller end of my dial tool or my hand tool, and I'm just going to push down. If there's any marks on the hands, it's always a good time to go ahead and clean them while you're here. I'm using a little bit of Rotico. And now we'll get the second hand on the watch. From this point, it's always good to test and make sure that you have no friction, no rubbing against the hands, the second hand, the minute hand, the hour hand, and that the minute hand or second hand clears all those diamonds in the dial. So once we've got that all set up, we can go ahead and move on to the next step. So here's my case screws. I ordered 2 new case screws for this watch. Remember we had one that was rusted in place. I did manage to get that out without damaging any of the frame. We did retap it just a little bit just to make the threads a little bit nicer. I'll put those 2 case screws in and we'll screw them all the way down. These case screws on these model watches, when you loosen them up, they will clamp the watch in the case. So we're going to go ahead and case the watch now. The case has been cleaned. I put new gaskets in the case tube, so we're good to go here. Now I'm going to gently push in the movement to the watch in the watch case, and then we're going to rotate it around just to make sure that the case screws are free. And I apologize for getting this off camera. It's a little hard to kind of look over the camera as I was filming. Now I'm going to line up the stem and the clutch and the case tube areas together so that they're all lined up. We'll put the stem and the crown in the watch. Using a small driver, I'm going to press the detent and gently push in the crown, and it'll click into place. And now we can just test it, make sure the watch winds and sets. Again, we test as we go. Now I'm going to loosen up those screws, and that's actually going to hold the movement in the case very tightly. This is also a good time to make sure that your hands are not rubbing against the crystal. In some cases with watch dials that have diamonds in them, you have to set them a little higher. They can rub against the dial or the crystal. So here we go. We're going to assemble the rotor system. Remember, we've already, in part 2, we serviced this, cleaned all the rust off, replaced the parts. What I'm going to do is put a little oil on that so that it's lubricated. There's a small circlip here that we actually have to get lined up with that center bearing on the watch, that rotor bearing. The rotor bearing, if it wears out, is replaceable. So I'm just going to get that lined up with that center bearing and just gently push it in place. Now it does not snap into place. It's only held in place through whatever means the gear that attaches to it holds it down. So I do add a little oil just to that bearing, just so when I put this gear in, you can see gently it has a ridge on one side, and that's where the circlip actually attaches. So the flat end goes, in this case, upward, face up. And we're going to rotate it as it is keyed to the rotor bearing. And once it's locked into place, it's holding that circlip in place. The oil just keeps it stuck to the bearing as we turn it over and line it up. So now we're going to line it up. There are 3 keys that hold this rotor system in place and 3 screws that clamp it down. So we'll go ahead and put the first screw in, and I always like to give it a little test to make sure that everything's free and the rotor is not rubbing against anything, that it's actually winding the mainspring. And if I'm happy with that, we'll go ahead and put the other 2 screws in place that hold the rotor system. Time to get a nice sharp driver. Once that's done, we'll go ahead and put the 3rd screw in and tighten that down. With the 3rd screw in place, we'll go ahead and get the back and put a new gasket on the back cover. Did go ahead and clean most of this out. I didn't want to polish too much of that corrosion there because it had some marks on it. I didn't want to lose those marks. We're going to go ahead and tighten that down. With that done, it's time to work on the crystal. So this watch came with a very dirty old scratched up plastic crystal. We're going to go ahead and put a new one on. I'm going to snap that into place. Again, remember, I don't have the bezel for this, so I can't clamp it down all the way, but we're going to go ahead and just make sure it's lined up. If it's lined up, we can go ahead and do a test on the watch. Make sure it sets and runs well. Again, if we find any problems, this is the best time to go ahead and fix them. So I'm liking the way that looks. It's pretty clean. Everything's kind of back to normal. There's the model number and serial number of the watch. And we're going to go ahead and just do a quick set on this watch and make sure it sets good. Kind of what I'm doing here now is just making sure that the watch, the hands move freely and that there's no friction, nothing touching. Now I'm going to go ahead and unscrew the crown. We're going to set that out to the first click, and we're going to go ahead and test the date, make sure that snaps into place, which it does. And once I get it to the correct date, we'll just kind of let it run for a while after I set it. That's pretty much it for part 3, guys. I hope you liked this video. This was a pretty fun project, although it took a while to get all the parts I needed, a couple of weeks to get everything done. Cleaned out in part 2, you saw me use the laser engraver that we have here to remove some of the rust, which was pretty fun to do. And here is the watch in its running condition. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing. And if you want to get notified every time I upload a new video, just hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and have a wonderful weekend.